Welcome, welcome, everybody. You've tuned in to another episode of Wigs for Wigs. I'm Joe Cook. I'm your host, and as always, we'll be joined by a guest today. And again, we're going to be talking about issues torn from the headlines. We're going to follow up on our discussion about the war in Ukraine. We got a lot of positive feedback from you out there in listener world to our discussion a couple weeks ago about the war in Ukraine, so we're going to follow up on that. But I do want to, again, thank you all out there for listening and continuing to download and listen to these episodes of Wigs for Wigs as we attempt to get this podcast off the ground. You know, this is just a little rinky-dink operation. We're recording it out of my classroom here in Jersey City, just on my phone. This is a very low-tech, low-budget operation, and I really do appreciate those of you who are supporting the podcast, downloading the episodes, telling friends about it, that they should check it out. And I really do want to encourage all of you to continue to be engaged with the podcast. I want to give a chance for your voices to be heard. So please do reach out to us, whether it's through Instagram, whether it's through email, which again is wigsforwigs@gmail.com, whether it's through any other means. If you're somebody who knows me, or you know Bill, or you know Frank, any of our guests, to reach out to us and give us your questions, your thoughts, your comments, so we can share them here on future episodes. But again, thank you again. Thank you. For those of you who are listening, again, please continue to reach out, tell others about the podcast, support it in any way you can, give us your thoughts, and stick around for 30 seconds here for a quick little ad, and then we'll be back with Bill Venezia to talk again about the war in Ukraine. All right, we are back here. First time in a couple weeks. You know, this podcast, as we've mentioned before, is governed by the dictates of our schedule as educators here during the school year. But we're joined once again by Bill Venezia, and we're going to be following up our discussion from our last episode about what's going on in Ukraine. So if you've not listened to that episode yet, please go back and listen to it. I highly recommend it. But today we're going to be following up on that discussion. Now that we are 4 weeks into this war in Ukraine, about a month into the war. So, and we're giving our thoughts on what's happening, because a lot has changed and some things haven't really changed in the time since we last talked a couple weeks ago. So, Bill, what's just your quick take on what's been going on these last, 2 weeks since we last talked?
Well, it seems to... the war seems to have stalemated to a certain degree.
Yeah.
And as it does bog down for the Russians, because I think the Russians thought that this would be at best a week, and now it's a month.
Yeah.
Allegedly, the Ukrainians are claiming that they've assassinated or taken out 6 of Russian generals.
Yeah.
And that there are somewhere...
Including a 3-star.
A 3-star, and there's somewhat of a hazy body count, which is sad to comment on that. It's reminiscent of Vietnam. But somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 Russian troops have been killed.
Well, look, even when the Russian Foreign Ministry is admitting that they lost at least 7,000 men, you can kind of assume that the number is significantly higher than that.
And also, too, it seems that a Russian supply ship of notable size, the first one to go into, Black Sea waters, was taken out sometime last night or this morning. And Ukrainians, probably very wisely, are not saying how they did this.
Yeah.
And I am sure that ultimately, when the Russians admit to this, because there's no mention of this in Russian media, shockingly, they'll blame the United States or other NATO countries, for their complicity.
Let them blame us.
Yeah. It's going to be extremely interesting to see what comes out of the NATO meeting today.
Yeah.
If I know that the United States has previously said that they wouldn't enforce a no-fly zone, and I also know that there's been some negotiations over the jets, but I think NATO's going to have to commit to give the Ukrainians what they need.
Well, I think that was a really smart thing by President Zelensky the other day when he addressed Congress. I don't know if you had a chance to watch his address to Congress, but where he ended that very powerful video that he played, which if you haven't seen it, you should go out and watch it, listeners. Just horrible imagery. It's hard not to have an emotional reaction seeing it. But he ended it with "close the skies," and that's different, very subtly, from institute a no-fly zone, which is he left some wiggle room there for President Biden not to commit American air power to shutting down the skies over Ukraine, but give us what we need to shut down the skies over Ukraine. And we saw the very next day $800 million in additional weapons given to Ukraine, largely made up of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and anti-tank Javelin missiles.
Maybe we get an answer to the question over the promise of jets, which I thought was heading in that direction, processing from the United States to Poland to the Ukraine. And I am sure that logistically it's difficult to get them there. And I think that the Poles are somewhat reluctant to open up a front for the Russians if, in fact, planes are launched against them from Poland. So it's, I guess those issues will get somewhat resolved today, one way or the other. I am somewhat hawkish on the fact that either or has to happen. All
right, bring Bill around as a hawk.
Well, you know what? And I'm not usually, and I do believe.
I am very hawkish in my foreign policy views, but I know you are not.
And I do believe that either or, because I think with the introduction by the Russians of those hypersonic missiles, our Patriot system, I am not sure how effective it would be against those. And
General Petraeus was on CNN yesterday saying that we literally have no defense against hypersonics.
And if they're launched from ships in the Black Sea, unless you take out the ships, how do you take out the missiles?
Well, that's the thing with, if it were to be our planes instituting a no-fly zone, which again I said last time we recorded an episode, and I'll stand by it, I'm in favor of. It's not just that we would have to shoot down Russian planes. That's not what we mean by a no-fly zone. It would really be an escalation, meaning we would have to also take out, ships firing missiles into Ukraine. We saw what's going on in Mariupol, that important port city that Russia is just, basically turning into ash. And it would also mean probably going over Belarus and knocking out missile batteries that are firing into Ukraine.
I think that's definitely what happened. You could see how the escalation, you'll hit a point of no return with regard to that. I think it's wise that the NATO countries are getting together, but something has to come out of that meeting today, in terms of where do we go. I think I don't know what public opinion, if there is such a thing in Russia. I do think that there are signs that, especially in the big cities, in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, there's a growing dissatisfaction, even with people who supported it, and some of
there are going to be
generals.
people starting to wonder what happened to my son, who was conscripted into the military, that I haven't heard from in the last 2 weeks.
And I do think that out in the hinterlands,
the Russians are apparently just abandoning their dead bodies in Ukraine, not even burying them or anything.
I think, Putin will never admit any kind of failure or defeat. Not that he's failed yet or that there is a defeat, but what he'll do is he will blame that on others. He'll blame that.
He'll blame it on the United States.
He'll blame it on.
He'll blame it on his generals. He'll blame it on his ministers. But
I mean, just that one image of him sitting at that long conference table on the end of the table, and people, I guess 20 feet away from him. Shows you I think it's.
I'm still not
it's
sure.
It's a metaphor for isolation. And I think he's becoming more and more isolated, which makes him more dangerous.
It does. And that's the question with, again, I am very hawkish. I don't shy away from that. But But, there's the famous story that Robert Kennedy told in his book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about Dean Acheson was brought in to consult on what to do. And he laid out what would happen if we hit the Russians in Cuba, saying, then they would retaliate against the target, probably Berlin. We would have to fire against them. They would fire against us, and that's the end of the ball game. What is Putin's response? That's the big question. If the U.S. does do what I'm saying I think we should do, which is take out those missile batteries, impose a no-fly zone, and what that means, that's the great question. I am uneasy about that because I do think Putin has a little bit lost it, and he is dangerous the more he feels cornered and alone and isolated.
I think that the American intelligence has basically been very good up until this point in terms of telegraphing, and I think for the world, what the Russians will do next.
Yeah.
And I do think that Biden's policy is guided by, okay, if this happens, this will happen. Which means that the war gets escalated to either chemical or nuclear, tactical nuclear weapons. Which,
well, look, and that's what you have to do. It's game theory. You have to figure out what will he do.
Right. But it's interesting to see.
Game theory is based on rational actors, though, and I'm not 100% convinced that Vladimir Putin anymore is a rational actor.
I think you're right, and I don't know how close the intelligence is to formulating an accurate picture of what that mental frame is. I'm not sure we have that capacity.
Going back to the planes you were saying about, it is complicated, us trying to give planes to Ukraine, and I'm not sure how much that would really help them to actually give them planes to use. They would need pilots and all who are trained on those systems. But I've been perplexed these last 2 weeks or so since we announced we were not going to go along with that Polish plan, just by the explanation that we don't want to do it because that would be seen as an escalation. We're very open that we're giving the Ukrainians Javelin anti-tank missiles. We're very open that we're giving them Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. How is it really a significant escalation to say we're also giving them airplanes to shoot down the planes?
I don't see the distinction. And not only is it to shoot down the planes, but the jets can be used as an offensive weapon too, to stem the infantry. It doesn't seem that. I think
Russia has been awful at. They have not really used what the military today would call close air support.
No.
Which is they are using their air force completely separately from their land forces, and it's not really clear who's in control of what's going on.
That's historic too. I mean, when Russia started to battle out from Operation Barbarossa in 1941, as they made their push west, Russian military strategy was behind the times in terms of using technology. And just to give you an example, if the Russians were going to clear a minefield, Western strategy was to send the tanks in first, followed by the infantry.
Yep.
Do you know what the Russians would do? They would send the infantry
just a large number of men running out
and
there.
then the tanks, because the tanks
you wonder how they lost 25 million men in
and
World
by the
War
way,
II.
their air force was kneecapped in the first 3 days of
they were a
the German
technologically
attack.
backward country anyway.
Yes, but whatever they had in terms of an air force was left in a burning heap on the ground. The Germans saw to that. But, due to Lend-Lease and everything else, I mean, we provided
them weapons, yeah.
They just didn't use them effectively. And, I think their military strategy in the Second World War was based on courage. And I'm not so sure the courage or the inspirational save of Field Marshal Zhukov. And there's a story about him. He was on the outs with Stalin.
Yeah.
He was in prison. Stalin himself personally went to the prison where he had imprisoned a number of his generals, which Zhukov was a member, and he handled them all pistols. and he told them, you can either go to the front and defend Mother Russia, or you can blow your
Or you can
brains
shoot
out.
yourself, yeah.
Zhukov handed the pistol back to Stalin and said, I'll go to the front, which was a wise move. And then sadly,
Became the great hero of the Soviet Union.
the great hero of the Soviet Union, who then was on the outs with Stalin by the time the late 40s came and the early 50s.
By
I
the death
believe
of Stalin?
I believe he was basically imprisoned again. So that was his congratulations from
By the way,
Uncle
just
Joe.
talking about the end of Stalin, have you seen the movie The Death of Stalin?
I thought it was great.
I love that
I
movie.
enjoyed it.
I really recommend that one to all you listening out there.
Yes,
The
if
Death of
you're-
Stalin.
If you're a Steve Buscemi fan.
Steve
too.
Buscemi as
Yeah.
Nikita Khrushchev, Michael Palin of Monty Python fame as Molotov.
No, Malenkov.
Malenkov, yeah.
Malenkov, yeah.
No, Jeffrey Tambor was
Jeffrey Tambor
Malenkov.
was okay. Yeah,
and
it
Michael
was-
Palin was Molotov.
It was a great movie.
That's a great movie.
Yeah.
If you have the chance to see it, listeners, it's
Is
a
that-
dark comedy about.
Is that a Coen Brothers movie?
That was, I believe, it was
Yeah.
the Coen Brothers.
Yeah, they do a nice job. They actually,
And Zhukov is a character in that as well.
Yes.
He's played by what's his name? The guy from The Patriot who played the evil British officer
yes,
in The Patriot.
yes, yes.
Can't think of that actor's name
I
right
can't
now,
either.
but he plays Marshal Zhukov in that movie.
well, I guess the proof will be in the pudding. What comes out of the meetings today?
Yeah. So just so we're all aware, and I don't know when you're going to listen to this. Just yesterday, President Biden traveled to Europe to take part in a NATO summit with the leaders of the other NATO countries, primarily focused on what is going on in Ukraine and how NATO is going to respond. So that's what we're referring to here as a meeting.
At the very least, I think he needs to shore up 100% support from Germany and especially Italy, who have been dragging their feet regarding Russian energy, gas or oil.
Well, that's a tricky issue because
Yep.
the European countries are much more reliable on Russian oil than we are. We only get about 5% of our oil from Russia, if I remember correctly. Most of our oil overwhelmingly comes from the United States and Canada.
Yeah.
Now, gas prices are up, but that's primarily because gas prices are on a global marketplace, oil prices. So even though
And worldwide,
we're not really losing oil supply because of cutting off Russian oil,
No.
nonetheless,
It's
the
market-
global supply is
It's
is
market
limited.
factors,
Yeah.
basically dictated by oil producers who have cut production.
Yeah.
And, it's interesting to see. Normally, as the weather warms up, gasoline production goes up too to meet the demand.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see if on that economic front, those oil-producing countries can up production, because it would definitely lend itself as a war effort against Russia.
Yeah.
So-
Germany is a wild card in that. They've been, Germany has started exporting weapons to the Ukraine. Who would have thought that would have happened any time in the past? But Germany was one I didn't know what to expect going into this because they do have a new leader. Angela Merkel is not the leader of Germany anymore. She's somebody who, was a reliable American ally, really, tough, could stand up to Vladimir Putin. And I didn't know what to expect from this new leader of Germany, whose name I can't even remember at the moment. I don't know if you know
No, I don't.
the name of the new chancellor
I know
of Germany.
he's a gentleman, but
yeah.
I don't recall his name. It's
They did cancel that pipeline. They've started sending weapons to Ukraine, but they are dependent on Russian oil in a way that the United States is not. The Germans.
hopefully we can help them in some way, shape, or form in getting them to get beyond that. I mean, it really was a mistake of Merkel's government to basically engage with Russia economically, but that was then, this is now. I think there's going to be pain borne by all of the NATO countries, but I do think that, you mentioned, when did you think that Germany would be supplying arms to the Ukraine? I think that's a direct outgrowth of the Marshall Plan and NATO itself, the establishment of. Because think about it.
Yeah. Which is actually what we're covering in my U.S. History 2 classes today.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, I think Putin has done more to solidify NATO, then which is at cross odds of what he actually wanted.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, I mean, let's be honest. I think he was counting on a Donald Trump re-election and Trump dismantling NATO in his second term. When
Yes.
he would be, not beholden by running for re-election again or anything. And
But hey.
and Germany joining NATO was one of the most significant outcrops of the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
That was one of the biggest things that President George H.W. Bush and his Secretary of State Jim Baker wanted to get out of the end of the Cold War in 1991 was a unified Germany within NATO. And one of the big battles was, would NATO troops be allowed in Germany? Would they go east of where they were already into former East Germany? And I don't know if you remember where Vladimir Putin was at all that moment. He was the chief KGB spy in East Germany. As suddenly that was coming under the auspices of NATO and the United States. So
the office of the KGB in East Germany, the field office, was right near the Potsdam Bridge.
Yep.
It's ironically where the big three met in 45 to basically talk about Europe post-war. It's also not ironic that Herbert Bush and Jim Baker were veterans of World War II.
Yeah.
So they were the last brain trust to be in the Oval Office. I mean, from
the last World War II generation people.
and they recognized the importance of it. Thank God. And I do believe that they spearheaded excellent foreign policy for the United States. Then, I mean, they shepherded in the demise. And it was a difficult time of the Soviet Union. I mean, okay, if you want to give credit to Ronald Reagan, also Pope John Paul, because I think...
the credit goes around.
And Lech Walesa with
Lech
solidarity in Poland.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's credit to go around, but...
and also
45 years of American presidents of both Republican and Democrat persuasion that... Yep. Look, they might have disagreed on different policies, and certainly they did, but they did have that shared commitment to the policy of holding the Soviet Union in check and ultimately seeing democracy and capitalism prevail in the Cold War.
Well, they exerted the external pressure, but I guess you could say, too, that most of the reason that the Soviet Union fell was internal.
The Soviet Union.
The system did not work. The Soviet Union collapsed under its own weight to a certain degree, and nothing was going to bring that back. I just find it interesting that other than the burgeoning oligarchy class of millionaires and billionaires in Russia, I do not think the lot of the common man in Russia has gotten any better. And ironically, the people where I believe there is some dissent around those larger cities, any places in the hinterlands are firmly behind Putin because that's all those people know.
That's all they know.
That's it, Well, Joe, I think that we come back at this next week to see what the fallout is or what the ramifications of today's meeting is.
All right, what do we think comes out of this meeting?
I think the very least that Germany basically agrees to curtail its energy purchases from Russia, actually does it, and Italy too. And Italy's part of NATO, and they really haven't joined this effort. I also believe that, given the fact that the Germans have promised that they'll spend 2% of their GDP on the military, that those are followed through. I also hope that there is some way that those jets, those American jets, get to the Ukraine in some way, shape, or form.
And if not jets, send in a heck of a lot more javelins.
Yes.
Heck of a lot more Stingers.
Give the Ukrainians,
give them everything they need.
Give them what they need, because obviously they've been militarily extremely competent. My only fear is that Russia just continues to pound the Ukraine and turns the Ukraine into a wasteland and
Well,
sort of like a
that's what they've
wasteland.
turned to. I mean, what
DMZ.
What exactly is Russia trying to achieve? We said this a lot in our last episode. It seems now that all they want to do is reduce the Ukraine to rubble.
You know, I think it's a matter of frustration that they haven't been able to achieve their current objectives. So the objectives have changed. And I think that they figure they'll win this war of attrition. And I'm not so sure they will. You know, I think that
Hey, Ukraine retook one of the suburbs of Kyiv yesterday. So good for them.
Good for them. And
But
you know what?
they
If
need more weapons and they need more support from NATO.
Absolutely. You know, I don't think
They need something to shoot at those Russian ships off of Mariupol. We
well,
said that one went down. We think
jets would do
yeah,
that.
jets would do that. But
You
they
know,
need something.
And I honestly believe that I don't think that NATO nor the United States has the will to impose a no-fly zone.
Yeah.
Though I wish they would.
All right. Well, we did it. We turned Bill Venezia into a hawk like with me. I'm going to end on that note. But we'll see. We'll come back next week. I hope you all have enjoyed this episode. Continue to follow the news, and please do send us our questions. We'll do another listener question session next week. So send us our questions about Ukraine or any other issues that are going on. We'll be happy to answer them next week when we come back with another episode of Wigs for Wigs. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.